welcome. Welcome to June's Ask an Ombuds lunchtime webinar. We are 1 minute away from getting started. I hope you can hear us there, folks who have joined us. And if you have questions or comments, you should be able to use chat or Q&A features. I'm sorry that the camera is not capturing Carrie as close up.
That's okay.
But hopefully you can see us both. Carrie and I are back for another round of Ask an Ombuds. So it looks like we have a good number of folks here, and it is 12 o'clock, so I think we'll just go ahead and get started without delay. Carrie, I've got control of the mouse, but do you want to do us the favor of just doing the real quick review of OEO and what we are, and we'll go going.
Great. I'm Carrie Basas. I'm the director of the Office of the Education Ombuds, and Rose is an ombuds with our office. Many of you know who we are because you're tuning in, but just in case you don't, we were founded 11 years ago now by the Washington State Legislature to address issues of education equity and to remove barriers to promote student achievement and reduce the opportunity gap. So a lot of that work is through information sharing, but also direct support of families and schools and communities. We have a lot of questions today, so without further ado, we're going to jump right in, and hopefully we'll have left some time for your questions too. So feel free to ask us clarifying questions along the way, and mute yourself, please.
Yeah, and let's make sure that I am sharing the screen. I think I am.
Yep.
If you cannot see the PowerPoint, just let us know, but otherwise you should have that. And Carrie, let me move us over to our summary of the areas of questions. I gotta say, we got a lot of questions in this time, and we're gonna try to do justice to as many as we possibly can. There were some tough questions as we round out the school year.
And we just wanted to give you an overview of the questions. We'll post this video after we've had a chance to edit it online. We're going to be talking about educational services during suspension, expulsion, extended school year for students with IEPs, consensus and decision making in IEPs, dispute resolution in IEPs. We get a lot of special ed questions, special education and ALEs, appropriate services for special ed, and a really big question at the end about inclusion and equity. So I don't know that we'll be able to do that one full justice, but we will try to start that conversation, and it's a really great topic for us to continue with a substantive webinar next school year.
Great. So
Rose, there have been some new rules when it comes to suspensions and expulsions. So it seems like new rules can prompt some new questions. So the law seems to say that you need to have equitable and comparable educational services when there's a suspension and expulsion. What does that even look like?
Well, that's a really great question, and it's interesting because we talk about new rules, and in this case, we do have a new state law from last year that was part of equity and addressing opportunity gaps that included some provisions around discipline, saying we have to make sure that we're not suspending access to educational opportunity as a punishment. And that means if there are times when a student needs to be removed from the school environment for a long-term suspension or short-term suspension, or through expulsion, it's now clear districts need to be working with the student and family to make sure the student continues to have access to educational services so they can keep learning. Now, what the law says is those services can be provided in an alternative setting. Some examples like online or one-on-one tutoring or alternative learning programs. And then it says the services that are provided in those alternative settings should be equitable and comparable to general education. But what does that mean? You're not going to be able to recreate what a student's going to experience in the day-to-day general classroom that they've just been suspended or expelled from precisely. So, equitable might mean that if it's a student who's learning English, they need to still get some English language services. That's one. And comparable might mean that you need to kind of keep the general core substantive curriculum. But how much instructional time? Is that direct instruction? Who decides how much? What subject areas? Are we going to include transportation? Because without it, would they be able to access? how long can it take before that all gets started? So again, these come from that law that passed last year. The rules actually, and I'm going to move to the next slide, are still in process. So OSPI is charged with developing the rules, which often provide some more guidance and detail on questions like this. They have been working on revising and coming up with some proposed draft rules in that process. And the latest we heard is expectation is that OSPI will publish proposed rules in June.
Okay. Well, that's June now.
So it's June now. So what that means is now is the time to watch out, because once they publish the proposed rules, then that's a period for public comment.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that once those proposed rules are published, any person can offer comment in writing, and they'll set up at least one public hearing where people can offer their input on what those rules should say. So I put in the slide a couple links. One, you can get alerts from OSPI's school student discipline page. And then the other is the page on OSPI where you can sign up to be alerted when they are proposing to change rules. And so when they publish those proposed new rules on student discipline that might include some more details on what these educational services should look like, you can get an alert and be ready to take a look at it. Does it offer you more guidance? Does it still leave questions open? And consider whether you're someone who might want to offer some public comment to OSPI, because they'll go through that another process of reviewing those comments and seeing if they should make further changes to those rules, which will then apply to all districts across our state. But so for now, I think in the meantime, it's just one of those times where staying in communication between the family and the school and any advocates that are involved, trying to think about, imagine forward, if this student is going to be out of the regular educational environment for a period of time, if we imagine them starting back up in 20 school days or 15 school days, what do we need to do in the meantime to make sure that they can start back up and be on track for success, so that they're keeping up in the meantime? And honestly, it might look a little different for each individual student. One student might have access online at home to computer services, and another student might not. One student might need some accommodations and supports, another student not. So
it's a good opportunity to come together with other people to take a look at those rules, whether it's groups of educators or PTAs or community groups, to weigh in together for that.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're looking at the rules overall and whether they provide guidance that's going to be helpful for families and educators and others, I think looking at a group can help you, because I tell you, sometimes looking at them individually, you're not going to spot something that someone else might spot at the time. And similarly, when you're working with an individual student and you're trying to think, what do we need? Getting input from various voices can be helpful, because you might be thinking, oh, this will work. And then you'll hear from their parent, oh, that's not going to work this way, but what about that? And, just putting those ideas on the table, hopefully will lead to some good planning for the student. Okay. Can I just say, Carrie, one thing? So on this month, we've done something that we hadn't done before, which was we had so many good, rich questions. We wanted to put information in this PowerPoint that we're going through, but there was just too much.
Yeah.
So we have created an additional resource kind of reference sheet that we sent out via email and we'll also post online. It includes the references on this discipline thing to the parts of the statute. And there'll be other things where we've put stuff in that additional resource for folks who want to dive in a little deeper. So watch for that on the website, and we'll send it out again via email to everyone who's registered. Okay.
So we're almost at summer. Some of us are in summer already. Some of us who are parents in Seattle, our second graders have senioritis. So, and they have since mid-May. But, thinking about summer and extended school year supports for students with disabilities, the question that we got was, usually these requests for ESY, extended school year, are based on regression and recoupment data. What does that even mean to a layperson? And what if you don't have that? Is there anything else you can put into the mix for the IEP team to consider when you have a sense that extended school year could be beneficial?
Yeah, well, and the question is whether a student needs extended school year services in order to receive a free appropriate public education
Mm.
overall. And so extended school year, or ESY, is a part of the special education rules that talks about some students are going to need services during what are otherwise breaks for students. So summer break, winter break. So extended school year services generally happen during breaks. They could also, in theory, be before or after school, but it's generally breaks that we're talking about. And what the rules say is that, first of all, districts need to develop criteria for determining whether an individual student needs ESY services. And it's not every student with an IEP, right? But some students, there's an understanding that, look, if we take a 2-week break or certainly a 3-month break, we are going to lose so much that what we do during those times we're in school is we're going to lose the value of that. And so what the rules say really is that a student should get ESY if it's necessary for FAPE. And one of the most common pieces of that is saying, is this a student who falls back so much, loses so much of what they have learned, in other words, regresses so significantly, and takes so long to catch back up to where they even were when they left off, that recoupment, that we can't afford to take a break, because otherwise, we'll make some progress one year and then we'll have to start all over and start all over. So you can't afford to take a break. That's regression and recoupment. It's usually based on data that teams can take before and after breaks, right? To track, did you lose a lot? Did it take time to get back together? But the rules also say that, look, that's one basis for determining whether a student needs ESY, but teams also should, there's also determinations of the IEP team based on professional judgment and consideration of a variety of factors, like the nature and severity of a disability, the rate of progress, emerging, this says emergency skills, but it really means what we mean is emerging skills, where like you're just on the cusp of getting this. And if you stop now, you're going to lose that like oomph momentum. So you really got to keep it going over the summer. So those are some of the things. It really is a decision that should be addressed by an IEP team. And so coming together sometime before summer break is important. Making sure that that data is going to be taken over the years, but over the course of the year in terms of regression and recoupment, but that isn't the only basis on which ESY eligibility can be found. So if we move now to the next slide, I think, right, this will be helpful in a follow-up question, because what if we don't agree on ESY?
Yeah, I mean, that can be one of the many decisions where people don't necessarily agree and they may not even understand where others on the team are coming from. So what if they can't decide about something like ESY or something else, and do things just stay in limbo? With ESY, summer's going to come, but there are other decisions at the IEP team where, what do we do? We've met a lot, we've talked, and we're still far apart.
Yeah, well, so it's interesting, and we do get a lot of questions about how do IEP teams make, because we hear that we're all equal team members, but then sometimes we don't agree, and then what? Well, the design of the IEP team process is that the goal is to see if the team can reach consensus, which is kind of like a general agreement. You might not be, this might not be your most preferred option, but you can generally agree. And to get to that consensus, we try to make sure that everybody can put their ideas on the table. And we talk about parent participation, making sure there's an interpreter if need be, that there's time to ask those questions, that there's information about what are the things we need to be looking at. So if you gather around the team and you're talking about ESY, and you're talking about, is this a student who really needs it? And people offer different perspectives, and at the end of the day, you just don't agree. At that point, because the district is responsible for providing a free, appropriate public education, it's on them. They have to make a decision, and they have to then inform the parent in writing of what the decision is, what the reasons for it are, what information they relied on, right? And then the date that it will be implemented. And on this slide, we have included that information about prior written notices, because that is the written notice that the district needs to provide each time a decision is made about a child's identification for special ed services, evaluation, placement, or, and it says provision of FAPE, so significant decisions about their services. So certainly a conversation about ESY will happen at a team meeting, right? So a decision is going to be made at that meeting. After the decision is made, the district gives written notice, says, you know what, we heard different perspectives on this, but we believe the student does not meet eligibility, for example. And so we are going to deny a request for ESY services based on X, Y, and Z. And here is information about your options if you disagree with us. That prior written notice, I know there are some districts that just do a really consistent, great job, and educators who do a great job of making sure that the prior written notice is clear, complete with reasons and what you're looking at, and addresses the decisions that the team is making or considering, and provided in a timely way. It's also an area where sometimes there's room for improvement, like maybe you haven't gotten in the habit of doing a prior written notice, or sometimes you'll see they're pretty bare bones, like we met and had an IEP meeting and updated the IEP because we are required to by law, because you have to do it once a year. Well, that doesn't really allow people who are coming later to look back and say, oh, at that IEP meeting, they were really struggling with something, and they decided to go this direction because, and now we have that historical information, or we don't. So I like to think of the prior written notice in this IEP team process as a really powerful tool to help clarify what decisions have been made, why they were made that way, and this allows this process that is ongoing year after year, a lot of times with different people coming and going, to have clarity. On the slide, you'll see I put in a link from OSPI. They have put out a short document that just says understanding prior written notice. It kind of distinguishes prior written notice from meeting invites, and puts a reminder that really these are things that need to go out with every time a decision is made.
So what if you get that prior written notice and it is pretty bare bones? Like we met because we had to, and otherwise we would have been past the deadline. And we met to develop new IEP goals, and there's nothing where you spend an hour or two really kind of hashing out something, and it was a difficult conversation. Is that the final round of providing feedback on what the prior written notice looks like? Is it a one direction communication, or how would a family or community advocate that's there go back and say, here's what I had, and I would hope that we would preserve as part of the discussion, even though I understand the decision has been made?
Yeah, I've definitely seen teams really get to greater clarity on those things by having someone respond and say, thank you for that meeting, and I'm looking at the prior written notice, and could we revise that to reflect that indeed in that meeting we talked a fair amount about whether we should increase or decrease time in gen ed, for example, just as an example, and we reached a decision, right? You may be in total agreement with that decision, but if it's not reflected, and if that back and forth consideration of factors isn't reflected in the prior written notice, then 9 months later, you might be looking at and thinking, I know we decided that that was what we were going to do, but I can't remember why. And so I think it is a helpful practice for families and folks working with families and educators to take a look back at that prior written notice and say, does this really reflect the conversation I think we had? Also, we're talking about prior written notices coming after a meeting. Sometimes they usually will, because you're usually going to have that meeting to make the decision as a team. But sometimes a parent will make a request, and that might be responded to without a meeting. And so it's really helpful for parents. So we'll talk about if a parent wants to request an early reevaluation, or a parent wants to request an evaluation, we'll remind them to watch for the written response and to not be afraid to ask for a written response if they don't get it. So just be helpful and remind the educator or the district person, I do need the written notice in response to my request for this, so that I can keep track of what we have pending, what you've decided and why, and then decide how I want to go forward.
Yeah, and I know as a parent, when we've been in this process, it's really helpful where, my team will share drafts before I get any really official communication, final communication. Here's a draft. And then we agree at that meeting, I have some notes too, because there's so many people around the table. Oh, here's what I had, and here's what you missed. It's much easier to do that in the collaborative drafting phase than after you've received something by mail. So it's it's nice to encourage that in a collaborative way. So we can't all capture all of the details sometimes in this meeting, and people may have different perspectives. It might actually be confusing after a couple hours of discussion what we decided, how that affected the rest of the pieces. So let's try to synthesize in a way that's not burdensome in either direction. Here are just some quick notes that I had. That are clarifying, not a start to a new conversation, which is definitely better to have in person than by email.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and sometimes part of that might be that we agree we're going to come back and talk about this again because we haven't reached consensus. We have to decide what we're doing right now. Are we changing it tomorrow, or are we keeping it the same tomorrow? But we might be keeping it the same tomorrow, but agreeing to come back and talk again in a period of time. And so, just seeking that clarification in writing helps with this next piece.
And what if we don't agree? Because sometimes we're not going to agree as an IEP team. And so what do you do then?
Yeah. Well, you know, so if you're sitting around the table and there's an issue, should we increase time in gen ed or not? Do we need to add an area of service or not? Should we change placement from here to there? Does the student need ESY? Yes, no. At some point, there just might not be agreement. And I think at that time, it's helpful to remember, for the most part, when there's not agreement, remember the district makes a decision and informs the parent of the decision, right? And so the first step for the parent is to see, do I have clarity on what the decision has been? Do I have a written notice of the decision about this thing so that I can review it and see if I'm clear on it? The next thing to think about is that typically the district will make the decision, and then it is on the parent to decide whether or not to take action. If the parent does not take some action, then that decision of the district will move forward, right? So then I guess in one way you say the ball is in the parent's court. And so then what actions could you take? And so I think the first round we think of is informal problem solving. Trying to think through, when we're having that conversation, was there information that maybe either I felt I had, but maybe other folks didn't have, or maybe none of us had, that if we could fill in that gap in information, we might be able to reach a shared understanding of what the challenge is, and then maybe that would lead us to a shared agreement on possible solutions, right? So is there information that we don't have that we could get? And then you can propose to the team to look at that. Sometimes it might feel like, you know, I think we're all putting all the possibilities on the table, but do we all actually know all the possibilities? And on this one, quite often an IEP team is folks that are right at the school where the student is, right? So building level members, the principal, a teacher, sometimes a speech language pathologist, but mostly school-based. And when you're school-based, you might be really working creatively, all the tools you have right there at that school, but you might not even know that there's something out there at the district level that could be brought to bear to help with this problem solving. And so one of the conversations I often have with families when they've reached kind of a loggerheads at the IEP team is, have you gotten someone, or has someone from the district office gotten involved yet to help explore options and see if you can reach agreement? So reaching up and reaching out. Do we have all the staff here we need? Sometimes if it's an issue around behavior challenges and you're trying to figure out what approach, some districts have folks on staff who specialize in working through behavior challenges. So do we have the right people? Are there staff? For a family member, it might be that there's someone else outside of school who knows this child really well and could bring some added perspective. So this is for thinking about who else within the school or district, but also who else within the child's life could add to this conversation.
Well, it could be a psychologist the child's working with, you know, an SLP. It could be in making, you know, a transition. I know in our own process, we brought someone from our daughter's preschool when we were thinking about going to kindergarten because of that was a more inclusive setting at the time for her. And so thinking about what that transition would be like and how they saw her in a larger environment than what she had experienced in developmental preschool. So in a community preschool. So it can be that because parents can invite and, you know, and guardians who would be most supportive for them
Right.
to provide those perspectives.
Yeah, so a parent as a team member of the IEP can invite another person to participate in that. Another idea for informal problem solving is to reach out to someone outside of the IEP team, outside of the school or district. And in that regard, I'm thinking of our office, the Ombuds office, the OSPI special ed parent liaison or family liaison advocates. And sometimes that reaching out is to help clarify, how does this process work? What are some of the options that I might not have thought of or the team might not have thought of? Um, are there different ways I could frame this? Kind of thinking about just getting some input on that. And then, if that informal problem solving still doesn't get you to resolution, there are some more formal dispute resolution options for special education matters. And here I always encourage families to take a direct look at OSPI's section of their special ed webpage that has kind of details about the three: mediation, citizen complaint, and due process. And they're all different processes, and within those, mediation is still really kind of an informal process. It's voluntary, it's a little more flexible. You see if you can reach agreement. Another tool that I think the awareness of it is still growing is that OSPI, through Sound Options, makes available free in-person IEP team meeting facilitation. So someone goes and helps a team work through an agenda, right? They're not going to go and direct you towards one conclusion or another, but they're going to try to help make sure that team process is giving space for ideas on the table, trying to work to consensus, getting to conclusion on those agenda items.
I'm sure some folks have questions about, is there any risk to pursuing one of those options? They're not binding, but is there some risk to bringing in a mediator or doing IEP facilitation?
That's a great question, a risk to doing mediation or facilitation. I think it's important. Mediation is totally voluntary. It has to be voluntary on the part of both the parents or the family and the school district. Also, once you're in it, it's voluntary. You're not required to reach an agreement. And so if you find yourself in it and you're just not feeling comfortable, you can move out of it. I think we certainly hear from family perspectives still a certain amount of fear that mediation or asking for mediation might be perceived as fairly aggressive or adversarial. And I think sometimes families wonder, look, if you really are in dispute, because mediation is voluntary, if they haven't been able to persuade the district to agree to something just by trying to share information and different perspectives, why would the district all of a sudden agree in mediation? So sometimes families worry, is that going to be time worth spent? On the other hand, I think mediation is a process that really tries to set up an environment where people are ready to think more broadly about what it is that will meet your needs and interests versus your very specific, currently I have this in mind, but could you reach the same goal with a different approach? And so I think mediation ideally is a low risk option because it gives you that chance to try and see if you can reach agreement. Certainly citizen complaint is a process where there's a formal complaint and OSPI does investigations and they make findings. Due process is an administrative law hearing, so there's a administrative law judge, evidence, including testimony and documents. Those are pretty involved. So again, I just really encourage folks who have questions, take a look at the website. You can call OSPI's special ed parent liaison or our office or others. We can't give advice about whether you should or shouldn't do one of those things or how to best frame your complaint, but we can kind of talk you through what the processes look like and show you where to find that information. One other option for families too that I like to make sure that families know about is our U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights has a complaint process as well. And because every child who has an IEP is protected under Section 504, which has broader definitions, a concern can be brought also to OCR. And one of the differences there is that OCR hears complaints about discrimination, including on the basis of disability. And if a parent feels that there's an issue with the IEP process, special ed, you can bring that through OSPI's citizen complaint. But if it's a complaint that there's discrimination on the basis of disability, that doesn't, you can see on the citizen complaint information that they address just violations of special ed rules and complaints about discrimination through OSPI go through a process set up by the Equity and Civil Rights Office. It's a lot of information there, but again, there's some good resources on those links to the websites, and folks are welcome to call. So as we truck along towards almost 12:30.
I know, and we will take a little bit of a breather before question 7 to see we have some other questions along the way. Feel free again to use the chat feature to type a question to us. If you need some clarification along the way, don't hesitate. So question 5 we had, how does it work if a student with an IEP is enrolled in a parent partnership program where some or all of the student learning is done outside of a traditional setting? I've seen this word ALE, or the acronym ALE. What does that mean? And how do students with disabilities fit into that? Especially when we're thinking about things like goals and instruction and data, if we're kind of taking it out of the traditional school building environment.
Right. Boy, this is one that I was thinking of when I was thinking of difficult questions for the month. So just kind of starting with a little background, our state has created different options. They're put under the frame of alternative learning experiences, ALEs, and that includes, and I'm not going to maybe remember this exactly, but where the instruction part or all takes place away from the typical school building, right? So it includes all of our online public school options, but it also encompasses these programs that many districts have developed, which are a partnership with families that really allow something that looks and feels a lot like homeschooling, but is actually a public school program. This is one, and I just want to emphasize this, that in our additional resources and links, we've included a link to where you can find a sample agreement that families are encouraged to look at, and is required by many of those parent partnership programs, that explains a little bit more in detail the distinction between homeschool, which is just the home is taking care of that, and the parent partnership program, which is a public school. And for kids with an IEP, of course, families can choose part-time enrollment in a public school to receive services, or full-time enrollment in a public school program. Those parent partnership programs look and feel and operate quite a bit differently. And so the working out the plan for how are you going to do special education services is maybe going to be a little bit different. But remember, if it's a public school student participating in a public school program, a parent partnership program, the rules around special education require that a certificated special education teacher, or if it's just communication, and I don't mean just, but that is a speech language pathologist, those are the folks that help design, supervise, and monitor specially designed instruction, right?
Yeah.
And so they don't always have to be the one who directly provides specially designed instruction, but they do need to be involved to do the design, the supervision, and the monitoring. And that monitoring is what happens in the data collection, right? Mm-hmm. And so the team would really need to figure out, what's our plan for data collection? When will this happen? You know, who's going to look at it? Where will it happen? Will the student need to be in a school setting, or the place? And so on this one, I apologize, but I am going to punt just a little bit here, which is that OSPI, a little while back, got together their special ed parent liaison and their equity and civil rights director or program supervisor, and together they did a webinar on understanding Section 504 and the needs, addressing needs of students with disabilities in alternative learning environments. And so on the additional resources too, there's a link to a PowerPoint from that webinar. And I would certainly encourage you, if you're an educator, a family, an advocate, and you have questions about how to really make this work in those kind of alternative learning settings, don't hesitate to call over to OSPI as well. You can call us and we can try to troubleshoot. I think it kind of really comes back to making sure the I in the IEP is given meaning, individualized, but you're also remembering that parent partnership programs are public school programs. So you're going to be looking back to the special ed rules on a lot of that.
And some of the programs will spell out, from talking to some of the folks who are involved with WALA, for example, the Professional Association, what is our setup for monitoring progress towards IEP goals? How often will you need to come in with your kid? And so all of that. So I'm just going back to what Rose said. We're talking about programs that are sponsored by the district. We'll have different formats and flavors, and they're going to have a process depending on how big those programs are and when they have access to specialists. So it's not you just doing homeschooling on your own or unschooling. It's within a certain structure. So there will be that interactive piece. Yeah. But we've got another question that we could address now or wait.
Well, right before we go to that question, Carrie, you referenced WALA, and that's the Professional Association of Alternative Learning Environment Educators. So what does WALA stand for? Do you have off the top of your head?
I think it's the Washington either Alternative Learning Association or Association of Learning Alternatives. But go to WALA, and they have an annual conference, which may have just passed, I think usually at Great Wolf. And it brings together a lot of the educators working in these areas for sharing, whether it's the newest technology platforms for online learning or it's sessions on how to support students with disabilities in the context of ALEs. So it's a good group of people who are dealing with, there's more and more demand for these options within schools.
Yeah, so nothing like tapping the experience of folks who've worked through these situations. So if you can connect with them, and if you want more details, we'll be happy to look it up and email you if you contact us via oeoinfo@gov.wa.gov. So now that question that popped up.
So we have a question. So we'll be looking off to the side. Back to disagreements with district decisions. What if, for example, a school is recommending a BI program and behavioral intervention, right? But it's at another school locations, and siblings attend this school, and the parent doesn't want kids at different schools, separate schools, and doesn't agree with the change in placement.
Wow, we'll pack several things into one question. I'm impressed and appreciate it. It's great. So a part of this question is the school is recommending what sounds like a change in placement, moving into a sort of specialized placement environment, a behavior intervention program. And those are given different names in different districts, right? But a lot of times they refer to a special education classroom where maybe most of the students there are struggling with significant behavior challenges. They might have more staff in that classroom setting. So it's a different specialized placement within a school district. It's helpful to remember, of course, school districts are supposed to have available a continuum of alternative placement options. And so everything from spending all day in a gen ed class with services there to on the very other far end, sort of home or hospital-based or specialized schools, and then kind of moving in towards the less restrictive, you're getting into those specialized, sometimes called self-contained special ed placements. And so if a student is, the proposal is to move from a placement where maybe they've had some pull-out services sometime in gen ed, maybe going to a resource room, and we want to move them into a self-contained behavior program, that is a change in placement. And I think we mentioned before that when the district makes a decision about something like that and informs the parent, the ball is in the parent's court to take action. Now, typically, let's say if there's a proposal to change the goals and the parent disagrees with the goals, or to change something else about who's delivering some services or something. So it's a change in services, but it's not a change in placement. And please don't ask me to describe the differences between those two right at this moment. If it's a change in services, the parent can do a citizen's complaint or request due process, but typically the district's decision will stay in place until that's resolved, right? There's a difference if the district is saying we want to change the placement, the overall nature of services, and the parent says, I disagree. If a parent requests a due process hearing, they can ask for what's called stay put. They can say, I'd like my child to stay put in this last placement that we had agreed on until the due process hearing is resolved and we have a judge decide whether this new placement is appropriate or not. And that technically comes in when a parent requests due process. I think it seems like often because maybe everybody appreciates that a change in placement can be a pretty significant thing for students. And if the whole team is ready and on board and believes in it, you're probably going to have more success. And so when there is a change of placement on the table and a parent objects, especially if the parent has a specific proposal of let's get more information, let's check this out, let's check that out, a district will agree to kind of put that on hold while you try to see if you can work toward consensus. In any event, if there's a change in placement, a parent can make a request for due process and get a stay put. But that doesn't address the different schools for siblings, right?
Yeah, and I would, so for that too, I would say just before we lose it is, I would be curious about when the last eval was done for the student and a functional behavior analysis. So I know that that's a lot to pack. You don't have to give us all that context because it might identify someone. This is a great question, so don't apologize for it, Roz. It just combines a lot of experiences and certainly things that we hear about. But just what is, going back to what are the specifics? What's the data for it? Who else can lend perspective, like some of the other dispute resolution?
Yeah, so that is there different information, right? So one question is, a lot of times before a district proposes a change in placement, the district will say we need to do a reeval. If the district had not said, let's do a reevaluation to make sure we have current info, then a parent can say, wait, before we change placement, we really should do a new evaluation, especially if it's been more than 1 year, to make sure we have updated information. Let's say the district has already done an evaluation, but the parent doesn't agree that it's accurate or really gives a good picture of the student. That's a time when a parent can ask for an independent educational evaluation and say, let's hold off on the change in placement until we get this independent second evaluation and see if it says the same thing or leads us in a new direction. So those are options when you're trying to work out, is this change in placement something that we can agree to, or am I going to dispute it more formally? Going back to that continuum of alternative placements, a district, it's at the district level that they're obligated to offer that. Mm-hmm. And districts are not always able, or there's not good reason, practically speaking, to offer each of those alternative placement options at a single school. So that means sometimes if a student does need a specialized placement that's not at their neighborhood school or at the school they've been assigned to, sometimes the district can say we need to assign you to this different location within the district. And that it can happen, and under the rules, under the special ed rules, typically you want to see kids served at their neighborhood school where they would be otherwise, but if it doesn't have the placement option they need, the district can assign them somewhere else. To deal with the issue of siblings, what quite often happens, I think, is that districts offer to allow the siblings to enroll in the school that's going to offer the placement that the student with special ed needs, so that you can keep siblings together. But otherwise, I don't know of anything that gives a right to say the siblings have to be in the same school. And so it becomes a challenge because sometimes you don't want to move the siblings. So then you are looking at separated schools. And I appreciate that is challenging. Ideally, and we would expect if the district is saying you need to go to this other school, the district will be providing transportation to get there and back. And so, I think, Carrie, your reflection, and Roz, I apologize, or thank you, Roz, for offering this. This just reflects the complexity and the multiple layers of the kinds of questions that often come in. And I think that reflects, that today's Ask an O webinar is a lot of questions about special ed, because I think it's not simple. It is a multi-step process. There are a lot of different pieces at play. And so I think taking some time to step back and think about what is your top priority, to reach out and ask for information is, it makes total sense. And that's why we want to be able to help provide more information to more people at once. So thanks for bringing these questions. I think we have another that goes back to,
well, and it's kind of related. I see it as, if you scroll up a little bit, I see it as related to Roz's. So the question is, not all ALEs are parent partnership programs. Indeed, they come in different flavors in different districts. Some ALEs offer a choice school, which is distinctive in offerings compared to traditional neighborhood schools. And that could be a different curriculum. Our daughter's at an option school within Seattle. They often claim that, so districts can sometimes claim they're not required to provide all level services at all locations within the districts, including their ALE schools. So I think this comes back, it's similar to the other. but here's an educational option for the student itself. But by not providing certain services at the ALEs, doesn't this mean that certain special ed students don't have access to those unique offerings, right? You know, let's say the ALE is an outdoor learning environment, or the ALE is an online school with a focus on graphic design. I'm making up things. I'm sorry if this matches any of your ALE programs, you know. So this seems like a civil rights issue. So how do you address that when we do have a range of options for schools that where students with disabilities may not, there may be hurdles to either having them placed there or having them supported. I think that comes down to some of the offerings that you were talking about that they had done together for the webinar.
You know, it's such a great question, and this really is kind of the question that the OSPI Equity and Civil Rights Office, together with their special ed department, were, I think, trying to address a little bit head on, that maybe still doesn't have super simple answers, except for the one simple thing that's pretty clear is that once a district decides to offer a choice program, an ALE program, whether it's online, parent partnership, or like Carrie said, outdoor learning. We know in Seattle, for example, there's the Nova High School. There's all kinds of different ways that educators have been creative with designing these alternative learning environments together with their communities. Once a district decides to offer that, a student cannot be denied access simply because of a disability. And so it should never be like, oh, you want to apply, you have an IEP. No, we don't take kids with IEPs. And I think we don't expect to hear that. And if you hear that, that's a time to say, wait, we need to have another conversation, because it can't be a blanket denial of access to kids with disabilities. Now, does that mean that those ALE programs are going to have to figure out how to serve every child with a disability and offer every level or continuum of services? I think that's a little more challenging. And what they talk about is trying to check and see. I mean, one of the guiding questions in the kind of the civil rights arena is this student generally otherwise meets the qualifications for this program, right? And so sometimes the programs are just by lottery. Sometimes there's a design of the program that demands certain things. And so it really should be an individualized conversation about, can we meet the student's needs here? Now, one of the things that really could happen, like let's say a school has created an ALE, it has a specific location, and they haven't assigned an SLP, a speech pathologist, to serve at that location. But you have a student who needs communication services who wants to participate in the ALE program. In that case, the district can maybe figure out, how do we have the SLP who works at this other school spend some time to meet the needs of that student over there? Because there's nothing otherwise about the program that is so that the student would not be able to access otherwise. So,
and it's been a year, and I'll admit to this, it's been a year since I looked at the definition for ALEs, but there's a specific definition, there's a technical definition, and I think that when we're thinking about whether it falls under that, same principles apply. You really want to look at the definition, which is at that OSPI guide, because differences in curriculum between schools don't make them ALEs, but it is that, you know, sort of that different model and different approach to schools. So you want to start by looking at the legal definition. That way it'll direct you to the right people, either within OSPI or within the district, because there are variations, but the variations themselves between schools don't necessarily make them ALEs.
Yeah, and I will just say, so ALEs, yes, alternative learning environment.
Yeah.
And it is in Washington State, it encompasses a whole variety of programs. Again, common ones, online, parent partnerships, other things. It's where there's learning programs, and learning can take place either in a classroom or not, right? And so it's more flexible that way. On the civil rights piece, because we're running short on time, I just want to say that it echoes some of the other broad questions we got today, which is, you know, we're working and we're talking about some of these things about individual services for individual students within the special ed realm. And our next question, actually, if I switch over, is really like all about, you know, as we're doing that, we're supposed to be making sure they're appropriate. What does appropriate mean? even as you're looking at appropriate services, I think it is helpful to every now and then step back and say, are we looking at equity access issues here, right? Because there's a question about, once you're there, is it appropriate? There's also a question about, can you even get there? Do we have access that's equal and equitable for students with disabilities? And indeed, several years ago, before there was really a lot of online schooling in Washington State, there was online schooling elsewhere in the country. And advocates brought complaints to say, hey, online schools have not made themselves accessible for students with disabilities. Now, sometimes in Washington State, folks have been able to build in capacity to make sure access is there for folks. And so the OSPI Alternative Learning Department has information about how to, that indeed you need to make sure there's access for kids with disabilities, and then in practice, how to do that. So thinking about that, think about, is there access? Is it only because of a disability that I might be denied? And if that's what it feels and looks like, let's circle back and take a look at this and think about it from an equity lens. And the OSPI Office of Equity and Civil Rights is a resource. The U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights is a resource on those pieces as well. So thank you for your really good questions. And should we move to our
Yes, that sounds
appropriate?
Good. So, well, you started on this already, but the specific question is, what are our options if we pulled our child out of school due to concerns that the district was not providing appropriate services? And now the district has agreed that they were not following the IEP and providing appropriate services.
Yeah. So on this one is maybe, I think the idea is there's been agreement. It wasn't what we offered, we promised we were going to do or something. So if a student was supposed to have gotten services but didn't actually get those services for one reason or another, and it comes to light later, a district can offer, or a parent can request, that there are compensatory services given to the student. And compensatory education services are services to kind of make up for what was lost. And they sometimes happen over the summer or after school. They're in addition to the student's ongoing program. And sometimes I've definitely seen where a district says, oh goodness, we did not have this position staffed, students went without, we need to make that up, here's where we're going to offer to do that, and we'll do the transportation and all that. I've certainly also seen it where, it didn't happen for one reason or another, and a parent presents a case for why it should be offered, and the district responds to that. And then, of course, it's something that sometimes comes out through an OSPI citizen complaint or through a due process proceeding. And there, as with other things, there's sort of this individualized question. What did the student miss? What would they need to make up for that? How can we kind of, in some way or another, kind of make whole for what happened? And typically, one thing to really keep in mind is that, if it's compensatory services, it's not usually hour for hour of what was missed, especially if you're thinking the compensatory services will be something like one-on-one tutoring, which is generally more intensive than classroom instruction that's more kids. So, but in the midst of this question is a question about appropriate, and we had questions about what does appropriate mean, right?
So we have a big picture question, and of course we have all of 6.5 minutes to answer it. So this is not going to be a great answer, and I will say, consider it like an amuse-bouche, really light appetizer, because it's something we really need to continue to talk about, just even unpacking the language. So, how can schools appropriately serve students with disabilities in inclusive environments and address equity for all or every student? I think we could spend an hour talking about what does inclusion mean, an hour and the roots of that, as well as an hour about what does equity mean. And I'll just say that we these are our buzzwords, right? We use them, and we know that we should be talking about them. But I often would like to ask people, and not to be just one of those like flippant students, what do you mean by that? Because I think even within my own office, within my own family, people I meet on the sidewalk, we probably have a lot of different definitions. And from racial justice, we're hearing from communities of color, we should be talking about equity means racial equity. It means structural racism. We shouldn't just think about it as this broad umbrella term. Rose and I went to law school. We're still recovering from that. We didn't go together, but it's a shared experience, right? So I'm a little sarcastic, so I'll just flag that. So equity is fairness in our profession. It means fairness, fair process, which is a lot of what the Ombuds work does. Inclusion, I hear inclusion being used in a racial justice context too. I come from a disability background. I think about it stemming from disability, stemming from IDEA and special ed, from that history. But I think we're using some of these terms interchangeably. I will say, to end my pontificating here, that I think it's really important to put more communities who are doing the equity work, the inclusion work, however they define it, in conversation with one another to see what is, a shared vision and some points of common understanding. And that's true of family and educator groups, because there are advocates within and outside of the system every day who are working towards this, but we don't necessarily all share the same vision for what that looks like historically or moving into the future. And we don't want to sacrifice anyone's experience, any student in that, because many of the students and families who call us live at the intersection of these experiences of oppression and discrimination. So it's really important to think about that.
Yeah, and I'll say that as the questions came in on these themes, some of them were very particular, like how can I support a student with a disability to get increased access to a general ed classroom, increase inclusion for an individual particular student. Other questions were really kind of looking at big picture or general understanding of, for example, the new US Supreme Court case that came down recently that looked at the question of what does it mean to make sure that a student has an appropriate education when they have an IEP. That case is called Andrew F. So as we're getting close, and I'm going to kind of talk fast, I really want to encourage folks to take a look at the additional references that we sent out by email, and we'll also post online and send again by email, because in there I've included references to that new US Supreme Court case, Andrew F. I've included some links to some thoughtful pieces about intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw, who I probably just mispronounced her name, I apologize, who talks about intersectionality. Also a lot of links in terms of resources for thinking about how to build the foundation to support inclusive classrooms and inclusive schools, because there is so much there. Because when we are talking about appropriate, one of the things that's so interesting is how these tie together. When Congress updated the IDEA several years ago, they referenced that 30 years of research has shown that it's by having high expectations and access to gen ed in the regular classroom to the maximum extent possible that we get to an appropriate way to support kids with disabilities, right? So inclusion is wrapped right in with appropriateness. And I think in terms of that equity piece, like Carrie was saying, we sometimes talk about equity for kids with disabilities or racial equity for kids of color. But we can't separate an individual student who lives at the intersections of those. And so the more we can think about when we're looking at systems and ways that we support individuals, think about how all those things come together, I think we'll have more successful outcomes. Just to think about, again, trying to think big picture, but also some strategies for individual families for today and tomorrow. Inclusion, I think more and more we're hearing about ideas of universal design for learning. How can you set up a classroom, a school building, so that from the beginning and ground up, it's designed to meet the needs of really diverse learners coming from all different perspectives. I can't tell you how many times you look at information about where inclusion works well, and leadership is key. You've got to have a good, strong leader to really have it blossom. But the other thing about it too is that it's never done by one person alone. If you want inclusion in the gen ed classroom, you need to make sure that gen ed teacher has time to collaborate with special ed providers. and that they are talking together about how to modify assignments, how to look at the curriculum and pull out the core pieces. When you're working with a team, I think look at daily schedules, try to pick it apart. So here we are, time is ticking down. We have some resources here, quick ones for unpacking equity and inclusion, thinking about hearing from people who are at those intersections, thinking about disability identity. There's a really interesting, if you haven't looked at it, report from the World Health Organization that really just kind of reminds you and gives you a deeper understanding of the diversity within disability experience too. And again, please check out those additional references we've pulled together. We know that people are having to sign off, go to the next thing. Please, we would really love your feedback. A quick little survey there on the slide. And thanks so much for tuning in. We are going to be on hiatus for July, which means summer vacation. Enjoy.
Writing annual report. But we will be on a hiatus for the Ask an Ombuds webinar. For that, we'll be back in August.
Yes.
And thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate your questions, and we will come back to these questions. They're really hard, but as you can imagine, if you asked a question or had a follow-up question, any of them could take an hour. So feel free to reach out if you do have a question later on, and check out the supplement that Rose was talking about. So have a good afternoon. Bye.
Yes.
Thanks.
Take care.
Okay, let's stop recording. End meeting.